Hey everybody, welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. It's the podcast where we debate, we talk to each other, us backlog boys, about which film should be the very best Picture winner of all time. That's right, my name is Timo. I'm joined, of course, as I am most weeks, by my usual compatriots, our comrades in arms here on our great struggle to figure out the best movie. It's Tanner, Tucker, and Abram, and today we are taking a trip way back to the past, almost to the very beginning, just a couple years shy of the very first Best Picture winner ever. But it's from 1930. It's All Quiet on the Western Front, directed by Lewis Milestone. Quite an interesting movie, I think, and a lot of stuff to talk about. But before we do talk about it and make some noise about the Western Front, got to give a little recap on what happened last episode, because last episode we talked about Russell Crowe starring in Ron Howard's A Beautiful Mind from 2001, which ended up at place number 20 out of the grand old number 46 on our list, so 20 out of 46 places. That's pretty good. Sandwiched, much to Tanner's chagrin, above Spotlight and below Argo. So maybe Abram's happy about Argo being up there, and maybe Tanner's upset about Spotlight being below A Beautiful Mind. I highly recommend watching the episode. It's pretty good. And well, I think we've got a featured comment from a previous episode that Abram has so delightfully agreed to read and talk about.
Yeah, so the Quest recording schedule is nothing if not irregular. So this featured comment actually comes from the episode we did on Gandhi, and it comes from our very good friend, and some might call him the fifth member of Quest for the Bestest, John Tour, who left an essay-length response to our Gandhi discussion. So we've taken out a little excerpt, and I think you'll understand why I picked this one. I can't believe I am saying this, but I am totally with Abram. This movie should have been about 45 to 60 minutes longer so that it had time to flesh out the side characters better. Making this biopic about one of the most important historical characters with a message that should also be repeated again and again, it also brings a lot of responsibility to make sure that the message comes through. I'm not sure if the movie succeeded in that. It's a very interesting point. I mean, he agrees with me, so I agree with myself. The film needs a little bit more space there.
Very profound, John Tour. Thank you for sharing that wholly original thought.
Yeah, I like that quote, thinking about the responsibility of the film, because I don't think we really touched on that a huge amount in our review. But another worthwhile comment. I love posting the video, posting it on Mondays. And then later towards the end of the day, I get to check in, see what the commenters have to say, because we always get great comments, and I really do love reading them about it. So if you are inspired to talk about this movie, if you've seen it, please do so. Come scroll all the way down to the comments box and drop us a message, because we read them all. Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about this movie? Anyone want to start? A little plot synopsis, maybe. I mean, it's certainly an older movie, and so it's got some quirks in the plot department, I would say for sure. But anyone want to lead us off?
I think what I would say the basic plot is, and I can't necessarily remember any specific moments or the progression between them, not by any fault of the film, but just its different structure, is following a group of high school men who have been sort of fed a lot of propaganda and nationalism and are convinced to enlist literally right out of the classroom into World War I. And they are just like, oh, hey, it's war. It'll be fun. We're with our boys. And then they got to go through training. And then they got to go to war. And they realize war is not a fun time. And it impacts them all in different ways. And, of course, some of them kick the bucket. Some of them get majorly injured. And the few that remain are scarred. So that's really the general conceit of the film. There are a lot of sequences in this, but I don't necessarily think this is about that strong core narrative.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to lead us off by elaborating on that, Tucker?
The reason I would say that is because on the whole, we don't really get to know the personalities of these characters intimately. We're sort of just led into World War I following a group of high school boys. Like, yeah, they are into this story. It's just that, what is the word I'm thinking of? That the perspective that the viewer is supposed to relate to is sort of an in on the story. I can't remember the exact terminology.
Dutch angle.
Let's go with that, sure.
Mise en scène.
But instead of following any specific character because of their personality, we're following a group of new boys and seeing how they change. And I never really felt myself super concerned or compelled by what was going to happen because I knew it was World War One. The war is going to end. Some of them are going to die, but more just feeling the general progression of them becoming jaded by experience and war.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a pretty apt description of the film. I kind of want to jump in and say that I surprisingly enjoyed this film a lot. I was looking forward to it, and I found its depiction of war fairly, if not unique, groundbreaking. I think similar things have been done since this movie came out in how to show war and show its effects on people. But I really have to think that this is the first. This is the first one to really use these very, very intense sequences, and I find that older films lack intensity a lot for me. I'm interested in them in a plot way, but the filmmaking of the older films, your proscenium arches, all these styles from way back even before talkies were around. This film breaks those molds, goes and does interesting stuff, does really interesting stuff with the sound design. I'm gonna talk about that a lot in this review because I really I am fascinated by the sound in this film. And while I think that viewing it from our 2021 perspective, it's a little less than original, I think it deserves merit for being first.
Yeah, I'd agree. I like I always do when we do these opening thoughts. I agree with a lot of you. I think this film it opens on a very interesting note, and I want to talk about that opening sequence with this speech from their teacher. And Tucker raises a great point about how we don't really get to know a lot of these guys intimately, but I think that's maybe what sort of Lewis Milestone and the writer of the book. I assume that the book is similar to this. We're going for. And I think that it starts out on a high note, really doubles down on that, and it's very solid for a good while of its runtime, and then it sort of falters at the end, which I'm sure we'll also get to. But on the whole, I'm positive on this, the oldest film that we've ever covered for the series.
True that. It is the oldest. Abram?
I'm very conflicted on this film. I think it does a lot of very interesting things. I think the fact that this American film, this Oscar-winning film, is told from the perspective of these German men says a lot by drawing a contrast. Perhaps that contrast says more than the film itself, as I want to talk about. And I think that those really in-your-face, visceral bombing sequences are incredible. And I think the film ends in a really potent way. But I think that it's kind of boring because ultimately when we're here for Quest of the Bestest, right, sure, we have to account for that historical perspective, but what's the best picture? So when I think about the themes this is evoking, I'd much rather follow those themes in a Platoon or a Hurt Locker, because what those have that this doesn't is compelling characters, even though a good 35-40% of this film wants you to care about Paul and wants you to care about Bane and these guys who you simply don't, because you are given no time to, but you're thrust into these sequences where you're supposed to. So because of that, I, like Timo said, it was first and it was important for that, and I think that the framing of this narrative from that German perspective is still fresh. A lot of this experience felt like something we've already had and had better.
Yeah. I think what really surprised me about this movie and what Timo was saying, giving credit for being first, is how not graphic it is, because obviously there were codes back then to prevent that from happening.
This
but
is maybe
surprisingly
even pre-code.
graphic.
Yeah, I found this film.
Sure, yes, but they weren't showing blood. They weren't showing arms being exactly blown off and all that stuff. And Tanner has, of course, trivia. But I was surprised at how graphic it was for an early film, even though it isn't the graphic level that we're used to today. For a 1930s film, I can't believe they showed some of this.
You see you see Paul stab a Frenchman, and you watch the Frenchman die all the way on screen, which is something that you couldn't get away with in the 50s at all. The Production Code Administration, my most recent object of Hollywood fascination. I'm really fascinated by the PCA nowadays. Yeah, you couldn't get away with that. And so I think that is a great point about how visceral this film is with its restraint, maybe. Tanner
he's currently panting and stretching and getting ready to spill
so
some
ready.
facts and knowledge upon us.
Okay.
I unfortunately put off the trivia collecting for this much too late, just before recording, and that's unfortunate because in my search I found a lot of interesting trivia that I'm going to try to sprinkle throughout. But in terms of the production code, since we brought that up, this film was allowed to have some of its more visceral, gruesome sequences for a number of reasons. For one, the production code wasn't really super enforced until 1934. For two, Universal Pictures decided that the subject material of the film was important enough that they would allow that sort of imagery to be on screen. And since we did bring up what I think is maybe like one of the most haunting and like shocking images of the film is that German soldier getting hit with a bombshell and just his arms left hanging on to the barbed wire.
That is wild. I was not expecting to see that. And it's not a shot that they linger on or put any emphasis on. It's a thing that happens in the sequence of an insane battle sequence. And it's like, oh, wait, did I actually see just bloody stumps of hands hanging from barbed wire? Like, oh man, that's probably the most memorable single shot from this entire movie, in my opinion.
That moment was actually recounted to director Louis Milestone by a German veteran who worked as an extra on the film. They had lots of German extras working as... or German veterans from World War I working as extras on this film.
I think this film is a testament to how something as like we think about a Hacksaw Ridge, or we think about the Normandy sequence in Private Ryan, right? Mm-hmm. Which are just fucking insane in their gore and in that visceral quality. But I think this film is testament to the fact that you don't really need that to horrify your audience. Yeah. I find the... and Timo, I'll just let you go with this, but the sound design of this film and just the scope of the production and the detail of these sets, being in that gross little bunker while they're being bombed and the dirt's falling and the sounds everywhere and people are screaming and they're trying to knock the kid out so he calms down. Mm-hmm. That's how you horrify me. It's not necessarily, oh, this guy's chest is blown open, or oh, there's the hand on the wire. This film does so much while showing so comparatively little visually.
I think the bunker sequence, the dugout sequences are some of the most moving in the film, where I feel that I'm most affected by it. The acting of these young men screaming their hearts out. As that whole set, obviously a moving set, the whole thing was built so that the whole thing could move, and there's dirt falling down. And the sounds of the bombardment going around are just, you're right, Abram, they're totally horrifying, and they work really, really well at what they're supposed to do. And I think that in this case, for this film, they work better than a gory sequence. Yeah.
I think I as well, a lot of those bunker sequences and the trench sequences, like, we get a good number of sequences where, we see the explosives going off on in the ground and the shells and the people running across the field, but we get an equal number of them just, like you said, sitting in the bunker and that constant barrage of shells going off. And, from what we learn in schools about World War I, that is pretty true to what the experience in the war was like. Back in 1930, they didn't obviously have a very good grasp on what PTSD is, but PTSD seems like an inherent part of war films nowadays. Even back in 1930, recounting a war from, 10, 15 years earlier they still, they handled it in a all right way for the time. They got the people who are screaming their lungs out in these bunkers. They have to be knocked out to calm down, otherwise they'll give away the position or what have you. I think it's a lot of that is very harrowing, and like I said, there's a lot of veterans who worked on this film, so probably true to form as well.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely was thinking about, as I was watching, I was like, whoa, the historical references that they could get for this are very unparalleled, I think. Just the proximity that the film had to World War I. There weren't really any other wars like this. Such a major event in world history that then was able to be captured so quickly onto film. It was at least interesting to me as we watched it. Mm-hmm. Tucker, you looked like you had a thought in your head there about something.
There's one rattling around in that empty cavern up there, but what I was going to say was, what I find most interesting about this movie is how it balances the two aspects of this war storytelling, which is cutting pretty quickly back and forth between really intense action sequences of wars and showing the trenches and explosions everywhere and people falling and really fast cutting and stuff like that, then to the in between those sequences where it just comes and goes on a dime and they have to be ready at a moment's notice to jump up. So they're sitting in the trenches, they're sitting in the dugouts, they're sitting, trying to find a meal and just talking to one another about their experiences. And while we don't necessarily know each of them specifically or know their personalities, I feel like there's a really good sense of humanization to these more grounded and personal sequences where they're just sharing life stories. They're talking about what got them into the war or what they don't understand. There's a lot of references to the fact that most of them don't know what they're fighting about. Like the war is just happened so quickly and they got inducted so fast that there's no like orientations like, okay, here's why you're fighting, here's who you're fighting, all that. They're kind of just like, I guess we're in the war now and this kind of sucks. And I like those sequences a lot, even though they're not the best they could be if we had more compelling characters and more investment in the characters. I think they do a great job at showing who these guys are and seeing their change throughout the movie. The really only thing that stays constant with all of them is their hunger. Is at the beginning they're hungry when they're fresh faced, and at the end they're hungry because they've been out there for so long. And that being really the only thing that stays consistent throughout is an obvious testament to how much changes and how much how much that impacted their lives.
What I think is interesting, and Tucker, what you said kind of reminded me of. I'm like, oh, so what are some through lines through this? Because we don't get a lot of like a deep character in this, but I think a through line is, and this serves the the pretty large ensemble cast that we have of that class of high school boys, is the expendable nature of these soldiers. I'm reminded of the sequence where we see the boots that one of them has, but he's laid up in the infirmary. He lost one of his legs, and he dies. So one of his friends grabs his boots, and that friend dies. So another one of their friends grabs the boots and ultimately dies. I thought it was going to go on longer, but I think it got the point across of like the people are expendable, but the boots are what stay.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you say that because for me, I also think that's one of the best sequences of the film, but I don't really think that's a commentary on the people as much as it's a commentary on the sort of war machine itself. I think this is a film that kind of tackles war from that sort of macro level.
Yeah.
To me, that sequence was about the ways that, these military outfitters are profiting, and it doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, 3 people in these boots. It's a pair of boots. It's a commodity. That's what war is to these people. And so I think for me, that's the lens the film takes, considering how it feels fairly impersonal in a lot of ways. And because I think that one of the boldest decisions the film makes, as I mentioned, is the fact that these aren't American men. There were American men.
Well, they are, but
they speak with American accents, but they're
canonically they are
German.
That's right. That's the point I want to raise, because the director is a Russian American filmmaker. He's not German. And if we're saying we're playing to the American Oscars, okay, America entered World War I late, but we were still there. So maybe you want to tell that from the perspective of these American boys to empathize with them, but instead you create as this empathy with who was ostensibly our enemy during that war, and the people who are terrorizing them are American and British and French, and what that causes you to think about, and in the path that takes you down, is really curious, and that's not usually the perspective we get these stories from. Even the anti-war stories, this is not the perspective we hear.
I was surprised about how anti-war it felt.
Yeah.
Like that sequence I was referencing of them sort of just talking about how they don't know what's going on in the war. It's like, that's pretty inherently anti-war. Is like, the war is so ridiculous and caused by such a tiny thing ultimately. There's the one moment where the guy's like, oh, well, why are just they fighting? How do countries offend one another? Is a mountain in Germany get mad at a field in France? And I was like, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Like, the fact that they are literally in the war, they didn't get to study it in history class 70 years later, and they don't know what's going on. I think that's really fascinating.
I think there's two things I want to say. One, that sentiment is parroted as what some 40 years later in Platoon. There's a similar sequence, and two is, and I lost my train of thought, and I'm trying to regain the controls here. is that World War One is a very interesting lens to look through that, because with World War II, if you look at like European engagement, obviously we're fighting fascism in that sense. But World War One, as we learned about it, was very just like interconnected. It was because a terrorist group assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in a different country, and so what country gathered all of its allies, and the opposite country gathered all of its allies, and they went to war because of that. It wasn't like some grander battle against an ideology. It was literally a guy died from a terrorist organization, so half of Europe or all of Europe went to war with each other.
Yeah, and the phrase at the beginning of the film where the characters are like, "Oh, it'll end by the years. It's going to be over by the end of the year." You know, is a phrase we learn in history all the time, but that's really how they felt back then. And so I find that the setting of this in World War One, it's the only war they could have picked from at this time.
Yes.
But it is really, really fascinating, and all the different lenses that you can take on war and say what futility of war, the pointlessness of it is really exemplified, I think, in this conflict. And the film does a fairly good job of instilling that. You were talking about the boot sequence. I was really just sitting here absorbing all these great points because there's some really good stuff all around. But about the boots, and the way I read that scene was certainly more personal. I thought it was a condemnation on the character at first, until we get the boots moving on and on and on. And so I think that while the film is impersonal and we are meant to see these guys as cogs in the greater machine, I did find myself connecting towards the end of the film with Paul, and especially with Kat and Chadden, the other guy, the older guy, the three who eventually become like the last guys in the squad, they worked good enough as characters in my mind. They weren't anything special, but I wasn't disconnected from them. I understood everything that was going on, and I felt, especially at the end when Paul goes back home, that was a very fulfilling character moment when he's speaking with the real rabble-rousing professor who is wrong, who is just wrong, and so are all the classmates, but nobody will admit that, and that's, I think, gets to kind of where I like the ending. I think maybe coming into the ending is a little weak, but when we get into the ending, it really leaves a taste in my mouth that's sour, but it's correct, I feel.
Sure. Quick thing, you brought up Shaden. The actor who plays him is named Slim Somerville. I think that's a great name. I just wanted to say that.
He needs to be cast in a Western.
Slim Somerville.
Well, I think it'd be tough to do that in 2021, but you know.
Well, yeah. Tucker, what were you going to say?
I was just going to mention how, while I'm talking about how I'm a little bit disconnected from the movie because it's not as character focused as I would like. I think it's interesting, and I'm kind of glad that it is this way because it sets itself apart, not being that exact same style of storytelling. It works surprisingly well in the investment of the characters and the progression of the story and those personal moments, even though we don't know them very well. Like, they are stand-ins for what we know to be the general idea of soldiers in any war. And seeing Paul come home, talk to his family, which is, a so-so sequence, but then having the sequence in the classroom where he's just stone-faced, and then talking to the guys at the bar where they clearly don't know what's going on. He's like, hey, no, I was there. Like, it's all through this lens of war and war experience, and especially all that starting through the general propaganda, nationalism, hullabaloo that kicks the whole thing off it's just fascinating. It's very impersonal, but it's a really interesting way to look at face value at what is happening here. Is the professor not knowing anything about war, and obviously that's becomes more clear in the second sequence that he shows up in, is just telling them like, no, we must fight for the fatherland. Your mothers and fathers will love you more if you do this. It'll be great. We're gonna win. It's gonna be amazing. And then, almost all of them die.
Well,
and they were what, like 17, 18 at the oldest, and that's really, really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I agree to an extent because it does draw into contrast Platoon, and it draws into contrast to Hurt Locker in the ways that I think those films tell the personal story but scale up, right? You think about Jeremy Renner's character. Jeremy Renner's character in The Hurt Locker is very interesting on a personal level, but what you can extrapolate out of him to a macro level about the effect of warfare on these men accomplishes in a more dynamic way what I think this film accomplishes in a broad stroke.
Sure.
And that's for me when, I mean, this show is a comparative review show.
Yeah.
And because of that context, I find it hard to be engaged in face of, I think, the success on the interpersonal, on the non-personal level. The intimate moments that we try to have, like going across the river to meet the French girls, or going back home to the family, or the sort of exchanges we get here or there, they just don't work because I know that we could be doing this with more interesting characters. And had this film, I think, been 90 minutes, 100 minutes instead of whatever it is, 210 or whatever,
Yeah.
or 120 in 2 hours, so 135-ish. If it had been like, let's say 30 minutes less, I think we could have nailed that non-personal approach without getting lost in the personal weeds that I just don't think are effective.
There definitely is a feeling of drag near the end.
Yes.
I was surprisingly invested in the movie, but as we reach that area of the third act, and this is not a 3-act structure, but when we're reaching the last 30 minutes, 40 minutes of the film, I'm like, yeah, this is still going, and it's okay stuff. But I think for me, watching the camaraderie of the first parts of the movie, what was really keeping me invested. And so when we do whittle it down, naturally so, to the surviving members, I become a little disconnected from what's happening on screen. I'm like, yeah, I can kind of see where these are going. Like, the war's wrapping up, he's returning home. Like, it feels like the natural direction of the film, but I certainly found myself being distanced from my engagement of it, and that meant that I don't enjoy the last third of this movie nearly as much as I do the first parts.
That's interesting that you said. Abram was talking about the effects of war on people, and well, let's just say it that the effects of war on the characters in this film is death. They all die.
Yes,
all
right.
of them die in the end, and so I thought that was that's a brave filmmaking choice to kill off every single one of your characters. But when we get to the end, and when we're only really with Chad and Paul and Kat, I become more. I get funneled into this narrative of Chad and Kat are the two guys who have survived. They have been in it longer than the other guys, and Paul is becoming a cat-like figure, looking for food, going out and becoming jaded. And so I keep questioning myself as we see more and more action in the film. Will they survive? Will they live? Will they be the guys who continue on? And so that's why I like how they all die. I think that's exactly the right move, that they should all die. And while I think that it going home, and there's sequences there at the end that definitely drag this idea, the question that the film is asking about these three characters now that we've whittled our ensemble down, and it's just these three guys. I feel I get a nice look into them when we're in the hospital sequence at the Catholic hospital. I think is fairly interesting about the dude you never come back from the dying room, but he does come back from the dying room, but it doesn't save him in the end. And so I think that there is still interesting stuff, and I think that there's still messages to be gleaned from that, even if I agree that it is not as good as the middle of the film. I think like the middle hour of this film is just kind of like pounding. It's unrelenting.
Yeah.
100%. And I think that's because of the filmmaking, which I was like, oh, okay, this is old school filmmaking. It's going to be really static. It's going to be pretty bland. But I think what they do with the cinematography and camera movement and all of that is just really fascinating. I mean, it's really dynamic. The editing is really fast in those hardcore sequences, and you get a lot of really interesting shot composition using silhouette and smoke and fog and the wire and the trenches and all that. It really is visually interesting in a way that I was not expecting from this old film.
Yeah,
that camera moves. That camera goes all over the place, and that's what I was really noticing. And I was like, yeah, I love how this camera's moving all over the place.
That that grittiness of how the majority of the film is filmed, really is juxtaposed with the dreamlike sort of thing when the teacher is describing the nationalist message to them. Yeah. I'm really just tying what you guys were saying into what I wanted to talk about before moved on to filming techniques, because I really do like that opening scene of the teacher brainwashing these students with these nationalist message. I tried to write down a few of the things he said, because it is really just like this film was made in 1930. The Nazi Party was gaining power in Germany at the time, but it seems like they just had the forethought of making this film like 20 years after World War II with the messaging that it had, the messaging that they are condemning in this. He's saying that he implies that like the nation gave birth to these boys and not their mothers, so why should their mothers control whether they serve their country or not? It's a lot of like really accurate stuff like that. It comes back again when Paul returns to the classroom and he's like, we die out there. That's what I don't know what you want me to tell you.
Yeah.
Literally, we all die out there. And then he ultimately he succumbs to the same fate. The last shot of this movie is him reaching out for this butterfly that is resting on the battlefield. And that really subverts the whole message of like heroism and masculinity and serving your nation and being a real man. The last shot of the film is him reaching for a butterfly, a symbol of softness and peace. Which, quick trivia fact before anyone jumps in, the hand at the end is actually not what's his name, Lou Ayres. It's actually the director, Louis Milestone.
He's a good hand actor.
Yeah,
that really is, for as much as I take issue with of the back third of the film in general, the final moments of it are really excellent. Because to continue that further, Paul's murder was not cowardice, but it was a sniper removed from where Paul was, and Paul was not even firing on him. It was in the context of the battle, it's not senseless, but in the context of its portrayal, it is a completely meaningless and senseless way for him to die. Just behind cover, reaching for a butterfly, and some random dude with a sniper rifle on the other side just shoots him. And I think that's powerful, especially after carrying Kat's, unbeknownst to Paul, Kat's dead body back because he thought he fainted, right?
Yeah.
I think to Timo's point about, we're just going to die in the end, right? Which I think is a salient point. The last 2 minutes of the movie really do establish that very well. Even if I think the butterfly thing feels a little bit weird because I don't really know what they were getting at, considering like the butterfly collection that gets referenced back home.
I think it's a little, they didn't exactly plant it enough. Had they planted it at like the beginning of the film, if we would have added 15 minutes of characterization while these boys are in school, boom. That last point would have really dug even deeper.
I do think it feels like there's a part of the opening that is missing. I mean, when Paul goes home and starts talking to his family, and he's like, he's obviously got his relationship with his sister and mother and father and all that. It's like, we've never seen these people before. Like, we're thrown right into the middle of like, oh, okay, yeah, I get. I mean, obviously he has a family and obviously he has relationships with them, but that was not established. And I think there's a more interesting cut of this movie that fixes a lot of the issues that we're talking about, simply by adding 10 minutes at the beginning of introducing the characters, their names, their relationships, their families, and their relationships to one another, and then throwing us into that classroom sequence where we can see them be corrupted by the propaganda. But that wasn't in the movie. And it leads to some weird pacing issues. It leads to some weird moments of character. We're like, what? Oh, okay, I guess we gotta catch up and tell what's going on. But I think it's a problem that it wasn't there.
Yeah.
I want to talk about one quick thing. So someone earlier mentioned, how the war affects the characters. It also affected the actors in the film because Lou Ayres, who plays Paul, became a conscientious objector to World War II after he completed work on this film. And because of that, many of the films that he was featured in were banned across the country because he was a conscientious objector.
Wow.
This film was also a huge gamble on the part of Universal Studios. There's a $1.25 million budget, which is roughly $16 million today. And this is coming just a few months after the production started, a few months after the 1929 stock market crash. So
spending that much money on it is just
greenlighting a film of this scope and the production that needed to go behind this. They dug actual trenches and had to like muddy up giant fields to film these sequences. Not to mention like the what am I looking for? The bombs. What are they called?
Explosions. They're explosions.
The explosion budget. I get pyrotechnics.
Yeah,
Thank-
pyrotechnics.
Thank you.
Sure, I see
Thank
what you're
you,
saying.
brain. The pyrotechnic budget for this, because those explosions that simulate the shelling along the trenches are very good, and there's a lot of them. They don't save them up for like a big action sequence. It happens multiple times.
Yeah, I mean, well, if let's do it. I'm getting into it. We're talking about the effects of this movie because,
Sure.
geez, I love how this movie looks and sounds when we're in the battle scenes. There's the scene around the church that I remember quite particularly because they have this church building and it like the whole thing blows up, the whole church, and it's the way that these battles are shot in such an understated way. There's madness happening all around. Hundreds of extras are running forward amidst real explosions, and then they're running backwards amidst more real explosions. They're running into pits and jumping over barbed wire and doing all these crazy stunts that. All of this is happening for real in front of us, and it's accompanied by the really excellent sound design of the just non-stop explosions. And thinking about 1930, I mean, the Jazz Singer came out in 27. Am I correct in that?
Something around that.
So we are a couple of years into using sound for movies.
At all.
Yeah, using sound.
Using sound.
And so here we are. Tons of off-screen elements, explosions, bombs, sound cues, all this stuff that's very, very fundamental in how you think about sound before. It just wasn't being done previously. And you have a huge amount of layering. I find that extremely interesting because layering is really, really difficult when you're recording to a one-track tape. You got one track, and every time you want to add an effect, you have to play it into a have to play that from a speaker into a microphone that's recording onto your master. And it's like, man, I don't know if there's any surviving documentation on how they did the sound in this film, but I would be very interested in learning that purely out of a curiosity factor. How did they accomplish that with such early technology? It would take a long time. It would be difficult to get something sounding this good today. I would have to work a long, long time to make it sound this good. And so that's
Back in the good old days, I did that in 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's a big
Kids
merit.
these days, I don't know how to do sound mixing.
Timo.
It's a big merit in the
Mr.
film, at least from my point, in that it is so engrossing and totally sells everything that we're seeing on screen.
Timo, Mr. Music Sound Man, did you notice the lack of score for this film?
I do now that you say there's a lack of score, but absolutely not while I was watching it.
Yeah.
Director Louis Milestone intentionally didn't want a score for this film, as he thought it would detract from the material in the film. He was very much into like the detailing of this film and also like the serious message that it carried, and I think that shows in a lot of sequences. But he was disgruntled to find out that a lot of movie theaters added in their own score underneath of it because they're like, we're not going to show a movie with no score. What are you, crazy? Because obviously this was coming just a few years out of where movies just had score for their sound.
Yeah, and so they had the facilities to add in their own stuff. That's very interesting. I'm glad I viewed a copy that didn't have the score because it works.
Yeah.
Yep.
Does anyone have anything else to say about it? Because I do have a trivia tangent to go on about this film's relation to a certain party, a political party that was in power during the time in Germany when it came out.
Let's go on Tanner's trivia
boys.
tangent.
Okay, well, if you can believe it, the Nazi Party was not a huge fan of this film. Wilhelm Frick, who was the Minister of the Interior at the time for the Nazi Party, banned the film because it portrayed Germans as, quote, ignoramuses and cowards. Which I guess, going back to the nationalism thing, it was only because it showed them having, like, human emotions and, like, not being into war. So...
And like not wanting to die, like
imagine
everyday
imagine
things.
not wanting to die for senseless reasons. Before it was banned, however, Nazi Party rabble-rousers, as they were called, would release stink bombs and rats into theaters where it was showing before it was banned. Which I assume would be it's sort of like an immersive experience because there's a sequence where rats are running along the trenches and they're trying to stamp them and stab them and stuff. So hey, maybe they were just trying. What's that?
They're hitting the rats with shovels.
Yeah, they hit the rats with shovels and stuff. So they did that. Then it was ultimately banned. But a few dedicated film fans would. There was special buses that would bus true cinephiles of the era to neighboring countries where they could watch the film.
Damn. That's
Yeah.
Wow.
dedication. Holy crap.
Yeah. And quick funny thing, one of the nations that also wasn't showing it was Poland, but they showed it because it was apparently pro-German, while Germany banned it because it showed Germans being cowardly.
Sure. It's all about perspective.
Yeah, truly.
Yeah.
But that is about it for trivia, and probably about it for my thoughts on it, I guess.
I'm ready
Yeah,
to give a
pretty
score.
much. You want to
So
give it a
am I.
score? Let's give it a score. Let's do it. Let's punch
Yeah.
those numbers in. We're going to go way down to the bottom here.
Oh my God,
Pull
look at
up a
this row.
number. And what am I thinking about? I think I've got my number ready.
I got my number 2.
Okay.
I would think.
I'm ready.
Let's hit that button.
Boop.
Wow.
Whoa,
very
man.
very unanimous. The score is a 7.73. And so that puts it, a 7.7 is going to put it pretty far up there. Let's take a look. We are not going to have to worry about any ties because it is going to go in between Grand Hotel and Platoon. It beats Platoon. Fair and square. There are no ties going on here. An interesting thing. I think, Abram, you bring up really good points about this being compared to Platoon.
Yeah.
And we're, well, I'll save my thoughts about that after we get through the point breakdown, because
Yes.
at the bottom, Tanner and Tucker tied it for a 7.5. Abram was next with a 7.9, and I gave it the high score of an 8.0. So we were, boom, right there. Pretty much everyone
Yeah.
thought about this about the same. My point from earlier being that I think the novelty of this film, the idea that it is the first, and that kind of lets it filter out above Platoon.
Yeah.
In
It's
my
really the
mind,
blueprint. Yeah.
it's kind of a blueprint film, but I definitely could see the argument for Platoon going above it, even though it won't. The numbers do not lie. There is no tie. Can I think of another rhyme with that? No, I can't. Let's keep moving on. Final thoughts, and then we should hit that spin wheel. Abram, since I think you sounded like the most dissenting. You didn't give it the lowest vote. I kind of want to hear what's up with that.
Well, I think you guys actually talked me up, not a full point, but I was thinking I was going to end up at a low 7 for this one, but I really think that this, for me, is right on the cusp of being great. I think it lacks those character moments that I really want that would have propelled it above, but when you contextualize the interesting lens that this film puts you through and just the emotional horror it puts you through, especially when you're wearing a good pair of headphones and you're viewing it in your dorm by yourself on a nice TV. It's a stressful experience. I think that to this day it maintains a lot of that texture and that character, which makes it, I think, as potent of an anti-war message as all the other films we watch that are in a similar vein, even if I think that those, being The Hurt Locker and Platoon to an extent, do just have more interesting characters and similar things to say.
Yeah, I think potency is a good word to use. I kept saying this throughout, but I think that the fact that this movie that's 90 years old now still carries a powerful as ever anti-war and anti-nationalist message, even including the fact that it was made before, like, we had the retrospect to look back on the events in Germany from World War I to World War II. The fact that it nailed those things, falling right in between those, is just even better for me.
His film is not hurt at all by the fact that it's from interwar period. Interwar cinema is an area that I'm really, really interested in. Weimar cinema is super cool. Weimar German cinema. This is an American movie, and but I think the perspective of it through the German eyes, but intended for an American audience, is something that will warrant for further thought tonight. Maybe when I'm laying in my bed, I will think about what that means. Mm-hmm. Tucker, any final thoughts before we wrap this whole shebang up?
Yeah, just a couple general ones. Just thinking about how surprising I found this film to be. I thought I knew exactly what it was going to be going into it, and I can't exactly say what that was, but it didn't match those expectations. I was consistently surprised by its surprising gratuity. No, it was more violent and more more visceral than I expected. It had a stronger anti-war perspective than I expected. It had a stronger commentary on propaganda and nationalism than I expected, and it being from the perspective of the Germans was also very interesting. Like, because they're the American actors and they're just using American accents and they just reference Germany, like the fact that they're Germans, they're not constantly reminding us that they're Germans. It actually took me a little while to realize, oh yeah, that's right, this is in Germany, and we're seeing this from quote unquote the other side. And all of that just leads this film being a lot more than I expected it to be, and I'm very happy that one of these older films actually does deserve the praise that it gets. This isn't one that's like, oh yeah, they were dumb back in the day, this is all they had. No, 90 years later, it still holds up to our standards and to being impactful and impressive.
Yep. There you go. And as a result, it earns 28th place on our list. So kind of about in the middle, but still, I think very deserving. I did not expect this film to come at me with the punches that it did throw in my way. Truly, things are not all quiet on the Western. Going your way. Do not get me started about that movie. Been learning a lot more about the context of that win in some of my classes right now. And whoa, boy, if I knew what I knew now when we were reviewing it, I would be from a way different opinion. Shall we hit that spin wheel? Shall we see if there's anything good in stock for us today?
Nah.
I sure hope so. Oh, wow. Dear Lord, I hope we get a good one. Oh, Christ,
dear Lord, I hope we get a good one.
We haven't gotten a bad one in a while.
That's true. Well, that means that we're overdue.
Oh, true. Yeah, fate has been tempting us.
Yeah,
a real bad Quest movie once in a while is fun, though.
That's true. That's true. How long ago was Crash? That maybe we weren't a past due, but Timo, let's spin the wheel.
There it goes.
Wheel, what's your deal? Give us a movie that makes us squeal. Is it on digital or is it on real? Wheel, what's your deal?
And the number is 4.
Ooh.
4.
Oh God, we're just ping ponging back in time here.
Yeah, true.
From back in time, back to the future. Really,
is that the movie that we're getting?
But, yeah, Back to the Future. Best picture.
Wow, Robert Zemeckis is Back to the Future.
Of course, classically being beaten by Out of Africa. Oh God, no. But what we're getting is the 2013 Best Picture winner, starring a bunch of big names: Paul Dano, Benedict Cumberbatch, Lupita Nyong'o, Michael Fassbender, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Paul Giamatti, Brad Pitt, Scoot McNairy. This is stacked. Directed by Steve McQueen. We're watching 12 Years a Slave.
Oh,
12 Years a Slave.
A very well-regarded film that I've never seen. It will also be our halfway marker in the quest for the bestest. If we include the Best Picture winner that we'll have in March, it will be our halfway mark.
Wow.
Cool.
We are halfway through this. That's incredible. It's taken us just about a year to do this halfway, but we are keeping on. And we will continue to rank, watch, review, discuss in not that order, in a different order. Hopefully we'll watch the movies before we review them. We'll be talking about 12 Years a Slave from 2013 next time. Thank you for joining me, fellas. We comrades, we're together as the band that would, I don't know. I'm trying to spin some.
We're a real couple of Kaisers, aren't we?
We're trying to spin some parallelism between us and the dudes who are in that in All Quiet on the Western Front. And the more I speak about it, the more I don't want to be in their shoes. And that's the.
We're brothers in quest instead of brothers in arms. How about that?
We're brothers in quests, and tonight it is All Quiet on the Western Front because not too much. Not a whole lot of dissent here, but very, very great discussion. I really loved all of your points. And so hopefully we can keep up the good talk with 12 Years a Slave. I can't wait to watch it and to talk about it. I'll see you guys then. Peace.